over the country, I think I have heard of some wonderful community events that are happening. So I think by the time the year is over, it will all have accumulated in something quite significant. What I have to say is very small and very modest in comparison to what other people will have been saying. And it concerns my father, John Vincent Bourke, who left, if you like, a diary or some memoirs before he died 20 years ago. And Declan Kybert mentioned to me last autumn that it's the small stories of people who were peripherally involved at the time that in some ways are the most interesting. So because of that, I dug out my father's notes and I found this tiny little paragraph dealing with 1916 in which he says, the family at that particular time were living in North Dublin and his father hadn't been well, and his father asked him if he would cross the city to the apothecary's hall and get him a bottle of Sloane's liniment. My father was age 7, Johnny, as he was known, little Johnny. And so he got his sister Annie, who was older, and Annie and Johnny set off to cross the city to get this Sloane's liniment. However, they found themselves going down Mary Street and into Henry Street. But he has these few lines in which, for an 80-year-old person reflecting back, he seemed to become the child very easily. And he said it was absolutely exciting. It was so exciting. There was noise, there was screeching, there was guns banging, there were people falling down, there was blood. He said it was just the most exciting place to be. It was also a bit scary. And suddenly, out of the blue, his sister realised the mum would be very annoyed if she thought that that's where they were. So he said, so we decided we better go home. So they went home, and he said for the rest of the week, the hero of the Bourke family was his elder sister Kathleen, who every day crossed the city and queued up in some bread shop. These people queued up for bread every day and got the loaf of bread and brought it home to save the family bacon every day. So it's a very small story, not a bit significant, but it's just a tiny vignette of what a little 7-year-old saw in Henry Street during the Rising, literally while the Rising was taking place. Well, I suppose it's a very significant year, 100 years of freedom. Thinking back to the past one that I remember, which was 1966, I think, when I would have been a little teenager at school, my father, who was then registrar of the NUI, was involved in organising honorary conferrings. And I remember one day he told me he was going to bring me up to Dublin Castle to meet some of these very important people. Meantime, my brother Geoffrey was involved in the pageant in Croke Park. He was one of the small soldiers wearing a fancy costume. And my other brother, I think, was in the FCA, and he would have been polishing his buttons and shoes for standing to attention in some particular event. So there was kind of an air of it around the house, all right. But my dad brought me up to Dublin Castle, and I met De Valera and Margaret Pearce and Nora Connolly and any other of the relatives of the signatories. Which, as a teenager, did I get my head around it? Probably not. I do remember my mum bought me a green outfit to wear. It had to be green. But I was aware at the time, I think, that it was pretty significant. And I have kept a few of those, whatever documents I could find, I kept, or else I gave them to UCD Archives. This year, I think there is a definite sense of major significance about the event. I'm trying to put together some things for my children who are in their 20s that they might want to keep. the National Gallery of Ireland, which is where I worked until very recently. I would have organised the programme, the public lecture programme for March and April, which is largely based on both the events that the gallery would have been associated with, plus links into World War I, plus trying to look at the Rising in a European context. And the National Gallery's exhibition will be James Stephens, The Insurrection of 1916 in the National Gallery. He was registrar of the gallery at the time of the insurrection. The acting director was in London. The director, Hugh Lane, had died the previous year. And when he was told about something going on in the city, put on his hat and coat, went off and wandered around the city to have a look, came back, closed the gallery. We were reputedly the last institution in Dublin to close, sent the attendants, the small staff home, and went back to his flat in Fitzwilliam and proceeded to write this very famous little eyewitness account. So I was conscious of that, and there will be some talks in the gallery about it. So I think it's just a very significant event, and I'm conscious of trying to pick up pieces of information that I'm sending overseas to relatives and people who I think will be keen to have them and to know how it's being celebrated. But the fact that UCD is doing all these major events I think is very important, and all the other institutions around the city, the archives, the library, the National Museum, the RHA. It's a particular importance because the Academy was burnt down in Abbey Street in 1916, so they also are marking it in a major way. And all over the country, I think, I have heard of some wonderful community events that are happening. So I think by the time the year is over, it will all have accumulated in something quite significant. One other thing I would say that I have found quite important is going through papers like the Financial Times, the Sunday Times, other papers over Christmas, and listening to the odd where somebody is being asked to predict what the important things will be. It's been very interesting to hear some English scholars and other historians saying, oh yes, of course, next year there'll be the Rising of 1916. You don't expect people to be referring to it from outside the country, but I think around the world there are a fair amount of historians and literary figures who are very conscious of it happening, and that I think is also very important.